is almost a part 2 of 2 webinar. So last week at this time, we had a webinar where I went through explaining how the CPLAN model and the DIME model worked. And today I'm going to go through a selection of the results from these 2 models. Now, also supporting me, like last week, we've got Professor Niven Winchester of the Auckland University of Technology and Motu. He's the person who developed the CPLAN model. And we've got Dr. Lynn Riggs of Motu, and she's the person who developed the DIME model. So they'll also be helping in the questions and answers section when we get there. Okay. And the slides don't want to move. There we go. Okay, so today's talk is going to be in 3 sections, and we'll stop for questions after each section. I'm going to talk again about our modelling system, and in this section I'll give you a really quick overview of the models and how they work. If you want to know in more detail, then by all means go back and look at the recording. I think Chris was posting a link to it in the chat before from last week. I'll then talk about some results from CPLAN and some results from DIME. Now, both these models have a huge richness of results, and a lot of those results are available in spreadsheets that we've now published on our websites. I'm going to go through a very small number of those results in quite a bit of detail with the aim of giving you the understanding of how you can interpret the results and how you can use them so that you're able to dig into the results and do your own analysis on the things you're most interested in. So moving on to our modelling system. So today's focus is around we've got three models at the Commission. We've got the ENDS model, which is that bottom-up model with the really rich technological detail. I'm not going to be talking at all about that. We've had separate webinars that have gone into detail on the results and how that model works. And then we've got the CPLAN model. So that's the CG model that looks at the economic impacts at a national level of our proposed budgets and that sort of thing. And the DIME model, which then looks at how employment effects are distributed. And of course, we do further analysis outside of these models as well to understand our what we're proposing and whether what the implications of what we're proposing are. All right, so CPLAN. So it's a whole of economy mathematical model. It's based on data, international data and New Zealand data from a US consortium known as GTAC, and some New Zealand data as well, a lot of which comes from either Stats New Zealand or Ministry for the Environment. The key thing about this model is that it shows the flow-on effects on the economy of emissions caps and other policies. And what makes this model a little bit different from some of the other modelling that we've seen in New Zealand in this space is that we've got quite a few ways that we can reduce emissions. So we've got some explicit technologies in there, things like electric vehicles. We can switch between different fuels. We can get energy efficiency through price changes. We can also put extra energy efficiency into the model from outside. And then if all else fails, and it usually is when all else fails, then we can reduce the output of a sector. And all these ways can contribute to reducing our emissions. And most of them don't have a very big impact on GDP. Now the DIME model, this is a statistical model, so it's very rich in data, and it's based on data from the from the Stats New Zealand data lab. And it helps us to explore the employment impacts based on CPLAN results. So we take the CPLAN results, we take a lot of rich information from the Stats New Zealand database, and we combine them to help us understand things like what's the characteristics of workers who are most affected? You know, where do they live? How old are they? What ethnicity are they? That sort of thing. So that's the 2 models that I'm going to talk about results from today. Now, the way we use these models is probably important to highlight again. And the key thing is that our budgets do not come out of our models. They're actually an input into the models. So first of all, we decide on the scenarios we're looking at, or also our budgets. Then we put them into the CPLAN and DIE models as constraints. And we use this to understand what the implications are. We also use other analysis. We don't rely solely on these models. So these are part of our information for deciding our budgets. They're not the whole picture. We then feed the information that we learn about the models back into our budget decisions and use that to revise things. Finally, for this section, I'm going to talk through the scenarios we've used. And these are different to the ones at ends. These don't match with the tailwinds and the headwinds that you see in the ends models. And that's because they're for quite different models. And so we use them in different ways. Having said that, the first one, the current policy reference, that is designed to line up with the ends one. And this is the scenario. It's like our baseline or our base case. It's what we think would happen if we don't change anything, what our model says would happen if we don't change anything. So it includes a bunch of current policies that have a big impact on climate change. So that includes things like freshwater policy, which isn't targeted at climate change, but does have an effect on emissions. And for example, the emissions price that we've got with the New Zealand ETS at the moment. So we've put that in as a constant $35 a tonne. Now, these are all intended to line up with the general government assumptions. They're meant to be common across government. Some of them are not fully up to date because we had to set these in place in August or September last year, just to do with how we meet all our timeframes. Now, we then look at four what we've called target pathways. And these are scenarios where we've just changed just a few things to understand how these few big things impact on the national economy and then flow through to different sectors and that sort of thing. So our first one, our target pathway one, we've set a certain level of forestry removals. And then with that basis, we then draw a straight line from our current emissions to our net zero emissions in 2050. And we put that into CPLAN as our cap for our emissions, and that's for the all other gases. For our biogenic methane, which in CPLAN has a separate cap, we are aiming for the easy end of the target, but we've been quite pessimistic on the technology available to meet that target. TP2, for all other gases and for our forestry removals, it's the same as TP1. But for our biogenic methane, we're going for the ambitious end of the target range, and we are, but we're being more optimistic on the technology. We allow there to be better technology to do that. Target pathways 3 and 4, these have the same methane assumptions as target 1. So that's the less ambitious end of the target range and the pessimistic technology. But for the all other gases, we get a bit tougher. So target pathway 3 and 4, we have less forestry in there. And target pathway 3, we do that straight line again between now and net zero, but with a tougher forestry. So that means we have to reduce our gross emissions more. And then for target pathway 4, we have the same level of forestry as in target pathway 3, but we're going hard to 2030. So we reduce our emissions much faster to 2030. And then from there, we go out to 2050 again with another straight line. And that line is, we're not reducing our emissions as fast in that situation. So I think it's probably now time to open it up if there is any questions before I move on to the CPLAN results.
We haven't had any come through just yet, so we can probably move on to the next section for now. Just a reminder, if anyone does have any questions, to pop them in the Q&A box. But if you want to continue with the next bit, Anita, we'll probably have some more as we go.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'll talk now about a small selection of results from CPLAN. I'll start with GDP, and then I'll move on to some high-level sector groupings, which help explain why the GDP result is what it is. And then I will talk a little bit about emissions values, the sort of pricing we get in the model and how we interpret those prices, because it's not, we don't interpret them as being as predictions for the New Zealand ETS. Okay, so first of all, GDP. Now you'll see on this left-hand graph on the side, this is a line of the projection, not the forecast, the projection of GDP by the model from 2014 up to 2050. Believe it or not, there are 5 lines on this graph. They are so close together that they are very much overlapping. You can just maybe make out faint different colors there, depending on how good your screen is. And what that says is that actually when we put our caps on, we have very little impact on GDP. So, and this is this difference here between the lines that you can't really see. This is the number you may have heard talking about, this less than 1% of GDP difference. So between our current policy reference scenario, which is the highest line, but it's at the furthest back, and even our most stringent scenario, which is the TP4, there's less than 1% here, and it only would take a few months to make the difference up. Now, I've shown you, on the right-hand side, I've got a graph here of the GDP annual growth rate so that we can actually see what the difference is and get a feel for the context of the difference compared to past changes in the GDP growth rate. So this black line here that goes from from the year 2000 up to 2020, this is actual GDP changes, and it's for the year ending March. So the latest year I've got on here is year ending March 2020. You can see it's starting to go down because we've got a week or two of COVID effects showing up in that. And we don't have the latest data because obviously we haven't reached the end of March yet. You can see the global financial crisis here where things dipped. And you can see it moves up and down a lot. And that's normal. We've got a business cycle, GDP, growth rate, it changes quite a bit over time. So the coloured lines, as before, these are what come out of CPLAN. Now CPLAN's base year is 2014, and that's to do with the GTAP data because we've got to get all the data, not just from New Zealand, but internationally into a useful format. And so the latest data available from GTAP is 2014. And then we project over time. We don't expect it to exactly match between 2014 and 2020. The model doesn't include everything that affects an economy. And so if we tried to make it match exactly, we'd be doing something called overfitting, which would then mess things up further on. But it does show, there's fluctuations and it's moving in loosely the same sort of directions. Once again, we do have, when we get down to this end of the graph, we do have 5 lines there. And once again, GDP growth is almost indistinguishable from when we don't take any action. The main exception is this teal line here, that's the TP4. And you may remember earlier when I was describing it, I said that we go really tough in TP4, we go very tough on emissions through to 2030, and then we ease off. And that does have an effect on GDP. And you can see that there. Once we get to 2030 and we take our foot off the accelerator, then our growth rate goes back to the same as basically everything else with a few more wiggles in there. So this is our big fluctuation in our results. As you can see, it's a lot less than we get in our normal business cycle. The other thing I'd say, this looks very smooth. That's because we're not trying to copy the business cycle. There will be recessions and booms between now and 2050, but they're not something we can predict or is useful for us to predict in this model. Okay, so there's been a lot of people asking, how can it be that the effect on GDP is that small? So let me go now to the sectors we've got. So I've grouped, there's more sectors than this in CPLAN, but I've grouped them into these sectors to make it a bit easier to put on a slide. On the left-hand side, I've got the greenhouse gas emissions from each of the sectors. And then on the right-hand side, I've got the output from the sectors. Now, if you're trying to add up the different outputs to get to GDP, that won't work because you end up with a lot of double counting just the way GDP is calculated. But the key thing to notice here is that if we start with our biggest part of our economy, That's the services sector. So that includes quite a wide variety of things, but all your everyday services, your haircuts, your visit to the dentist. I'm struggling to think of other ones right now, but it's just your everyday services, and they make up a big part of GDP. They don't make up a big part of emissions. They're not an emissions intensive activity. And so when we do our actions, there's pretty much no difference between the scenarios in terms of our services. We do reduce the emissions from the sector a little bit. So we've got our, in the dark blue is our current policy reference. That's the one that doesn't meet the targets. And all the rest do meet our emissions targets. And it's a little bit lower. The other thing I should note is that I haven't included removals on this graph. So that's why it doesn't look like it reaches net zero, is because it only has to get down as far as the removals are balancing it. Now, if we think about the other sectors we've got here, there's a small decline in the output for manufacturing, but it's very small compared to the size of it. In fact, the only one that has a decent percentage drop is the fossil fuels, which we've kind of expect. It's very, very hard to reduce our emissions while still using coal and natural gas and the like. But even though these sectors will have a large reduction in percentage terms, which means we need to care about them and we need to think about supporting the people who work there and helping out those things, they only make a very small part of the economy, and it doesn't flow through particularly to affect the rest of the economy, so that we don't see a big impact on GDP. On the other hand, when we look at the emissions side of things again, we can see that in all these sectors, so transport, fossil fuels, electricity, manufacturing, food processing, agriculture, we're reducing the emissions in all these sectors, and we're doing it with little or no impact on output, fossil fuels being the main exception. So that's how we can reduce that's the evidence that we've got, that we can reduce our emissions without reducing our input based on what's happening inside the model. And this is because we've got those technologies. So for example, our food processing, we drop down to basically zero. And so that's the coal boilers that Fonterra are using are switching to biomass or electricity, for example, and other things like that, that fuel switching, that technology that helps us out. These are all the things that allow us to reduce our emissions without reducing output. Okay, so finally, for the CPLAN sector, these are what we're using for emissions prices in the model. Now, just to emphasize, like I did last week, these do not represent any sort of prediction of what we think would happen in the New Zealand ETS. And there's a number of reasons for this. Probably the key one is that this doesn't model the New Zealand ETS. There's some really major differences. For starters, we have a split gas. We have two sets of prices for our long-lived gases, our all other gases, and a separate one for our biogenic methane. And that's important for the modelling because it allows us to have that split gas target. But it does mean that it completely doesn't represent the New Zealand scheme. We also do not include forestry. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is the technical reason that when you put removals in there, you put negative numbers into the model and that messes with the maths. The other reason is that at the sort of prices that the model is getting to, models have a tendency to say that all of New Zealand will end up covered in forest. And we think there are reasons that we don't necessarily want to include in our models, but are important and relevant that mean that that would not happen in New Zealand, and so is unrealistic. Now, the key thing that we use these for is understanding what causes the emissions prices to change. And that's an indicator. If you've got the price shooting up, that's an indication of where you've got a tight spot, where it's getting really hard to meet the caps. So looking first of all at the left-hand side, where we've got the graph for biogenic methane. And I'm just going to talk about this pink line here, because the explanation I give for this one is going to basically apply to the other lines too. Now this pink line is our TP2. So this is where we've got the ambitious, or more ambitious target for methane reductions, but we've also been a bit more optimistic about the technology. Now what happens in this first section here is that the reduction in emissions that we're asking people to make is faster than the speed that the technology is coming online to help do it. So we would expect that we're getting a little bit of loss of output here. But the key thing is that that could shoot up quite fast. But then we reach a turning point. Now, the exact year of this turning point, do not trust the model to tell you what that is. The key point is that there will be a turning point where the speed that the cap is getting tougher is matched or bettered by the speed that the technology to meet that cap is improving. So what we've got on this side is that the cap is increasing faster than technology can keep up. On this side, technology is keeping up with the increase on the cap. And so we catch up, we potter along, we have to have enough of a price there to make sure that people use the technology. We assume the technology gets a little bit cheaper over time. And then we exhaust the potential for the technology. Again, that date is not meaningful, but the concept of there comes a time when we exhaust the technology and then the price shoots up because we have to start reducing output. That's the important concept for us to pay attention to. And more than likely, what will happen between now and reaching this point is that we'll have more technological innovation that will help us out, that will push that point further into the future. We can't guarantee that. We need to be thinking about policies to help make that happen. But that is probably what will most likely happen. So on the other side, this is our all other gases. You can barely see it hiding behind the pink line, but TP1 and TP2 basically have an identical price path. And basically, our cap gets tighter. We have to do more and more expensive things to reduce our emissions. And we just carry on like that. Now in TP3, we've got a tougher cap. So we have to do those things faster. And we start getting to a point where the curve's bending upwards, getting steeper. That's when we're starting to have to think about reducing output in a serious way. It's when the technology, again, is not doing a very good job at keeping up. Now, finally, TP4, and this is our toughest scenario. So remember TP4, we were going really hard to 2030, moving our emissions down as fast as we could. And then we were taking it easier to get to net zero over the remaining 20 years. So we've got this going on here. Our technology is probably not keeping up. That's probably why it's moving so steeply. We're getting those hits on output. We get to this point and we take our foot off the accelerator and the technology can keep up and catch up with what we're requiring for our emissions. And then, like in TP3, we start running out of options. We don't have the technology anymore. And so prices go up. Now, once again, especially when we get into this area, we think that the model is probably missing out on some of the innovation that we would expect to see happening in reality. Now, one last thing before I open it to questions. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this earlier. I don't have the preferred pathway on here of our budget paths. We hadn't done that calculation until very, very recently. But what we have found when we've run the preferred path is that it lies between TP3 and TP4 all the way out to 2035. So if you are wanting to know what the budget is saying, what the impacts of the budget are, basically it's going to be in between this medium blue line and this teal line on any of the graphs. Okay, so let me open that up for questions now.
Thanks, Anita. I've got one here that might be good for you and maybe Chris to chip in as well, but we'll see how we go. When you say optimistic about the technology, do you mean you hope someone will invent something that doesn't already exist so that production can continue without reducing herds, or only reducing herds marginally?
So when I say about optimistic technology, we don't know exactly how much the technology is going to cost at this stage, and we don't know exactly how fast it can be taken up, and we don't know exactly how effective it will be. So we get a range of values for each of those parameters. And when we're talking pessimistically, we're talking at the low end of that range. So when it's more expensive and lower uptake and that sort of thing. And when we're talking optimistically, we're talking towards the higher end of that range, the better end of that range. So faster uptake and cheaper and that sort of thing.
Can I just jump in on that one? So we based our assumptions in all of our modelling on the work of the Biological Emissions Reference Group, which was a kind of joint industry government piece of research from a couple of years ago. And what that looked at was the kind of technologies which could break the link between kind of feed input to animals and the methane coming out of them. And so I think if I remember correctly, we were looking at in a kind of more pessimistic scenario, looking at things like methane inhibitors being available only for dairy herds, but more optimistically, if you could get a vaccine to inoculate animals against kind of methanogens in their rumen, then that's something that could be also kind of rolled out to sheep flocks as well. So that's where some of the difference is coming. But it, as Anita says, it's really uncertain about these, which is why we've tested a range of sensitivities and different scenarios.
Thank you both. We've had a couple more through that I'll ask before the next section as well. How sensitive are all of the scenarios to electricity price assumptions? For example, if prices were 10% higher than GDP change would be, higher than the GDP change would be. Okay,
so in CPLAN, the electricity prices are not something we feed in. They're actually something that, while I wouldn't look too deeply at what comes out of them, they're more something that comes out of the model. So CPLAN works by figuring out the price at which supply equals demand. And it does that for everything, including electricity. So we've got a demand for electricity coming from consumers and from industries. And the electricity sector says, well, I'm going to supply this much electricity for that price. And the model just keeps working out the maths until it finds out where the supply matches the demand. And then it says, right, that's the price for electricity in that year. So price is not something we feed in. So it's not something that we can ask the model to do 10% higher. We could perhaps put a tax or something on it. I think that would be quite artificial and probably not helpful in this situation. Niven, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Just to say that in the current policy reference, we are calibrating to projections for electricity by technology, and there's a lot of decarbonisation going on there. So we have quite a bit of carbon-free electricity in the current policy reference. When we move to the policy scenarios, if there's a higher carbon price, we see greater penetration of those low carbon technologies. So the exogenous inputs here that may change the GDP impact would be if our projections in the current policy reference, if it was a more fossil-based electricity system, then any target would result in a higher carbon price and ultimately higher GDP impacts. So there is a response to the model from the assumptions going into it. But as Anita said, it's not a direct assumption of we're dialing in a particular electricity price.
Thank you both. Are you assuming the uptake of any existing technologies or of specific new technologies?
So there's a handful of new technologies that go in, and they have, I'm pretty sure they have constrained uptake rates. But we've got electric vehicles for both household and commercial transport. We've got the methane technology that I talked about before for reducing the methane from dairy and beef and sheep. We've got biomass and electrification of process heat. So that's about Fonterra and the like, switching the boilers from coal to using a different fuel, namely biomass or electric heat. and we have carbon capture and storage for geothermal electricity. So those are the technologies we've assumed to go in there explicitly, and most of them we think of as new and not happening, I think, or not already happening. I think we've got a little bit of electric vehicles and maybe a little bit of methane inhibitors going on initially. The rest, so existing technologies, they're generally built in terms of our starting data, in terms of the existing structure of the economy. But they're not labeled explicitly, but we can switch between different types of technologies. So using an energy sector example, it's not in there explicitly, but if you are heating your home, you can use electricity to do that, or you can use coal, and the prices will allow you to switch between them. You can also use a more efficient or a less efficient electric heater. So you can use a bar heater that's cheap to buy and less efficient, or you can use a heat pump that's expensive to buy but much more efficient. And the price between the capital, the cost of buying that bar heater versus buying that heat pump, balances against the price of electricity for using that heat pump or using that bar heater. And the model allows switching between them. And not just a yes-no switch, but some people using them and other people using others.
Thanks, Anita. We've just got one more before we move on to the next section. So about the model, can it freely shift the economy, say, towards a service economy, or are there some constraints there?
So it can't do it quickly and instantly. There is elasticities that kind of, they say that that your services and your manufacturing are not exactly the same thing. And so you can't just quickly swing between one and the other, but you can move between one and the other. But I think Niven probably be good if you came in here, because you can probably give a much more thorough answer to that than I can.
Yeah, well, what Anita said is correct, but I'll just add to that also that we have this capital vintaging in the model. So when capital is installed in a particular sector, a large proportion of that becomes locked into that production technique. So we can't take a coal-fired power plant, for example, and use that capital to start up an accounting firm with. So that capital rigidity slows down any wholesale transition, as well as the reasons that Anita highlighted.
Thanks, both. Anita, do you want to continue with the presentation, and we'll have some more time for questions at the end?
Yes, okay. So now we'll move on to some of the results from the DIME model. And what I'm going to do in this section is I'm going to go through the graphs that were in chapter 12 of the evidence report. And I'm going to talk through what they mean and how we can interpret them and how we can use them. First of all, I do need to show this. This is a requirement by Stats New Zealand. Whenever we're using their data, we're required to put this disclaimer up, and it basically says they're not official statistics. Stats takes no responsibility for what's being said, and we have followed quite strict rules about maintaining the confidentiality of the data that's in the Stats New Zealand Data Lab. So first of all, let's talk about the fossil fuel sectors. So this is grouping coal, oil, and some of the supporting gas and some of the supporting sectors together, and looking at the impact of the changes in our different scenarios on the number of jobs that are available in those industries. And one of the very first things, so the other thing I should say, this is average annual employment change in each of the budget periods. So the next 4 years or so, the following 5 years, the following 5 years after that. And in each year, the industry may grow or it may shrink. And if it grows, it'll gain jobs. If it shrinks, it'll lose jobs. It's not quite as simple as the output. It's more about the labour, which can change different to the output. So in any individual year, it can gain jobs or it can lose jobs. And in any of those fossil fuel subsectors, so in gas or in coal or in oil, they can gain or they can lose. So that means we can see that there are some jobs being gained and some jobs being lost in these group of sectors in this period of time. And so the net effect, that's the dot in the middle there. Now, this very first bar here, this is our current policy reference scenario. So this is what happens when we're not specifically trying to meet our targets and we don't meet our greenhouse gas emission targets there. And our fossil fuel sectors actually decline, even in the first budget period, and lose jobs quite a bit. In 3 of our 4 scenarios, they actually, in some cases, they decline slightly less than they do in our current policy reference scenario. So in these 3 scenarios, in this first budget period, we're losing the same or less jobs from these sectors as we would otherwise. Now, TP4, remember, that's the one where we are going really hard out to 2030. We're going a lot tougher. And so, as you'd expect, we see a lot more effect on the fossil fuel sectors. In future budgets, again, we're seeing a bit more effect in our other scenarios. This is because it's quite necessary for these, because it's very hard to keep a coal industry going when you are trying to reduce your emissions. And again, the bigger effect is on TP4. Out in our third budget, TP4, we've actually taken our foot off the accelerator, and so the job loss is not as tough. Now, this tells we do need to be paying attention and helping out the people who work in these sectors. It's going to be especially important the more stringent our budgets are, especially in the near term. Now, another sector that draws a lot of attention is the sheep and beef cattle farming. The way the sectors work, we've also got grain lumped in here as well. And once again, this is on the same scale as the previous graph. And because this is a larger sector, we see more impacts on jobs. Now, again, we don't see a lot of difference between our current policy reference and what we think would happen anyway, and our scenarios. This is partly to do with how these sectors go through CPLAN. So in CPLAN, there is a fixed amount of land set aside for each type of farming in each year that changes over years. And that's the main driver of how much the farms output. So we wouldn't expect to see a huge amount of change. Now, according to our analysis, it looks like we're probably losing jobs, even in our base case, in the sheep and beef cattle farming. When we reduce our amount of forestry, the forestry land, or the land we use for forestry removals, tends to come from sheep and beef. And so that means that in our more stringent scenarios, in TP3 and TP4, where we have less removals, it means that the sheep and beef sectors have more land and therefore don't shrink as much. So that's what we've got going on here. The other thing we've got going on is when we do bring online our methane reducing technology, we assume that requires additional people to get that technology into the animals, whether that's injecting the animals, whether that's putting a supplement in their feed, or however else it's done. We assume that more people are required to get the methane inhibitors, the methane vaccines, any other methane reducing technology into the animals. So while we see job losses across all 3 budget periods, in general, the job losses in the CPR, so when we're not trying to meet our targets, are generally the same or worse than the job losses when we do try to reduce our emissions targets. So that's actually a relatively good news story from an employment point of view. In terms of when we take our actions, we don't see a large number of job losses. In fact, we see job gains because of our actions. Okay, finally, get to the regional impacts. And this is a sort of analysis. We can also do this, and you can do this as well using the results we've published. We can do this for other breakdowns like by age or ethnicity and things like that. There is actually 5 graphs in our series in the report, but they don't fit nicely on a slide. So I've just shown the last one here. And this is the net job change by region. So what that is we take each industry So let's use services as an example. And we say, so first of all, we take each industry, we compare that to our current policy reference, we find the difference between them. And we find, with the difference between them, we find out how many of those people are in which region. We do that for every industry. We then add up the people affected from each region. So where we are gaining jobs relative to the CPR, which might mean we're losing less jobs like we did in the beef and cattle industry, that's a positive. And when we are losing jobs compared to CPR, that's a negative. Add them all together and we get something like this. And what this indicates is that we've got a big downwards in TP2 for Auckland, and the size of that is partly because Auckland is big, and so we'd expect to see more job changes relative to the size of Auckland. These are somewhat smaller changes than we're seeing in other regions. We're seeing Wellington, West Coast, and Taranaki being hit by the job changes. I'm not 100% sure what the story is with Wellington, but for Taranaki and for West Coast, it's because these regions have quite large fossil fuel industries. So obviously the West Coast and coal, Taranaki with oil and gas. So that means we need to be paying attention to these regions. We need to be seeing what we can do to help the workers in those regions move on to other roles. In the rest of the country, we've actually generally got a net positive impact, and we've actually got a bigger impact in our most stringent scenario. It appears that we need a lot more people to be working to move to our low carbon economy, especially when we're trying to do it fast, than we do for a higher carbon economy. So that was what I was planning to talk about for DIME. So let me open up again for questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen now too.
Thanks, Anita. And we've had a couple that came through just before that section. So have you considered switching from petrochemicals to bio-based products in addition to biomass for fuel in your scenarios? How might it affect your results?
So we have only really done the switch to biomass. We're very limited in the number of explicit technologies like this that we can fit into CPLAN. If we try and put too much in, then we'd still be waiting for the computer to calculate the results. Things like other biofuels apart from biomass, they're more dealt with in the ENS model, which has a lot more technological richness in it. In terms of how they affect the results, I guess it's got to do with how big a change they would make, whether or not they would be replacing the petroleum-based fuels, or whether they would be replacing, for example, electricity. So for example, if we're talking about transport, then if electric vehicles are cheaper than biofuel vehicles, which I'm not the expert, so I don't know whether that's the case or not, but if they are, then it will have very little impact to have the biofuels-based vehicles in there, because we can reduce our emissions using the electricity-based ones instead. In terms of some other things, I think actually it's probably useful for me to pass over to Chris at this point. Chris has been a bit more involved in the ENS modelling, which has dug into some of that.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. We haven't really looked at kind of in great detail at kind of non-petroleum kind of petrochemical products. In any detail around kind of substitution of other products. It's definitely something that's interesting, particularly if you think of what's the transition away from fossil fuels and what's sustainable in the long term. But it's not something we've looked at in great detail for setting these budgets.
Thanks all. And we've just got one more here at the moment. Are you assuming people will only make market choices based on price to decarbonise, i.e. the use of electricity rather than coal for heating? Or do you see a role for regulatory change, i.e. banning household coal and burning coal for electricity generation?
So in CPLAN, we haven't modelled any of those regulatory changes like banning coal or anything like that. We've just looked at if we were doing it through a market way and assuming prices, so both the price of coal and the price of the emissions price going on top of that, and relative to the price of the other fuels. So we're just using the market to bring the levels of coal down there. I'm just trying to think if we've done broader analysis on that. Can you remind me of the question again? I'm going slightly blank. Or Chris, you've just come on, do you?
Yeah, so I suppose in our models, you know, we've used a kind of the simplifying assumptions that, you know, we use in economics around kind of, you know, people making decisions based only on the kind of costs and benefits of the choices they face. But in reality, we understand there's going to be a range of barriers and other kind of market failures, which might mean that people don't switch either at those prices or at all. Which is where, you know, if it was simply a case of leaving it to the market, our report would be significantly shorter. So we've got a lot of recommendations in our report, particularly around things like the use of fossil fuels for certain processes, and, you know, the you know, ending connections to the gas grid is an example of that, where you know, we're seeking to kind of edit choices where they wouldn't be consistent with that kind of long-term aim. So the model, it's not incorporated in the models, but it has been part of our thought process coming to recommendations.
Thank you both. And we don't actually have any more questions, so we've just had a comment saying a very interesting and eye-opening discussion, thanks. So unless anyone does have any more questions, I think we'll give you 5-10 minutes back in your day. I'll post the link to the consultation site in the chat in a minute, and to our events page as well, so you can see previous webinars that we've held if there are any that you have missed. And whilst I'm doing that, I'll hand over to Anita to close us out with the karakia.
Kia tau kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o tō tātou ariki ihu karaiti. Me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga, ki te wairua tapu, ake, amene.